Smash!
Hey, today we're going to be doing our first faction focus for this Quar's war. This, of course, being the Gwynts.
Oh, great heavens!
We'll be going over their lore, talking about building them, and doing a little bit of painting. Keyword a little. I think from now on I'm going to limit the amount of time that I'm actually painting on screen, just to keep things a little bit more fresh. But I plan to make this series ongoing, and I plan on covering just about every faction in the series. And I'll probably make a follow-up video to my Crusader and Kaftiran video, as I want to go into a little bit more depth on building them. But before we get into it, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, share it with a friend, and if you really dig it, consider becoming a channel member. Get some extra goodies in the lower tiers, and the higher tiers you get a weekly Q&A, as well as exclusive sneak peek channels in the official Discord. Huge thank you to my channel members. You guys are amazing. But enough about that, get tucked in, have a moth cake, and let's talk about the Gwynts. So who are the Gwent? Well, the country itself resides within the confines of Kaftir. They're essentially a part of Kaftir itself, being more or less like a colony of sorts. They recognize Kaftir as their sovereign, pay taxes to the crown, as well as enjoy the king's protection. Now, there are actually a handful of these said principalities, but the nation of Gwent is undoubtedly the most recognized and stands at the forefront. Due to the nature and geographical makeup of Kaftir, that being mountainous and riddled with ravines, the home turf of Gwent is isolated with a small and comfortable population. On top of this, their land is teeming with mineral riches and wealth, as well as a significant strategic importance to the Kaftir Empire. As a result, the crown has afforded the people of Gwent great privilege as well as a pretty significant amount of slack in terms of their autonomy as a nation. Now, the nation itself comes from humble beginnings, being settled by trappers and loggers respectively. This soon, however, changed once they discovered the ever-flowing riches the land provided. Now, at the time, the kingdom of Kaftir was significantly smaller and its influence was not within the grasp of Gwent. Of course, the Kaftirans still had their eyes on him. The empire was essentially in its infancy of its golden age, and it practically sprang up overnight. But like I mentioned previously, the Gwent's geographical advantages came into play here. The only access to the Gwentish plateau was through a narrow passway. This passway was known as the Kilkenneck, or the Neck in our tongue. Even getting a bunch of wagons and beasts of war through this treacherous set of mountains would be a task in its own. But the Kaftirans would prove to be patient. They wouldn't attempt to invade until centuries later, after they had made improvements in navigating an alternative route. No fewer than 4 full Kaftir armies had attempted to make their way into the Neck. An absurd amount of forces, but they still got their asses kicked. The Neck itself was teeming with fortifications, as gun emplacements were literally built within the walls. To the south of the Neck was another large wedge of rock known as the Zadel. The Zadel was dozens of feet higher, and the surrounding rock had countless guns and turrets cresting its brim. These guns were primarily armed by Tulmarese and Mere Breach mercenaries. Originally I was actually going to talk about these guys, but I'm going to save it for the next episode. Once the Kaftirans were aware that outsiders had invaded into their homeland, this would fuel their zeal even further.
Get the hell out! Get out! Get out! Get out!
They declared they would see the Zadel fall, and the Kaftirans would keep their promise. Despite the utter onslaught, the Kaftir troops would endure. A 5th full army would actually reinforce the remaining troops, and they would prevail. They didn't even need to fight. At this point, the Gwentish king had personally stepped forward to end the bloodshed. Being that the bulk of his fighting forces wiped out, there was no point in keeping it up. A deal would eventually be struck between the nations, and thus the Principality of Gwent was born. That and every Tulmarese foreigner aiding the Gwentish resistance would be utterly obliterated. Several years later, the Gwents would prove to be an invaluable asset to the Kaftir Empire, as they would bail them out after the desolation that the Crusaders made against their homeland. The nation of Kaftir was in need of rebuilding, and the Gwents were relatively unscathed. They'd share their immense wealth with the father nation, and wisely would give way more than Kaftir could ever hope to repay. This forcefully locked them into renegotiating a far more lucrative agreement between the nations. Kaftir is now indefinitely indebted to the bankers of Gwent. This not only grants protection, but autonomy, as well as a little extra help in terms of their expansion endeavors. Now, the modern-day Gwent aren't as well stocked compared to most militaristic forces, mostly because they just don't need to. Hell, they're a banking colony that has Kaftir by the wallet. But that isn't to say that plenty of Gwyntish forces aren't sprinkled within several Kaftir armies. Now, the main army that they primarily serve within is the Alliance. The Alliance is an army commanded by the Gwynts themselves and composed of Gwyntish and Kaftiran forces respectively. The Alliance was actually formed as an extra favor for their financial aid and serves primarily in the offensive line of Tolmor. That's right, even though Tolmor actually aided the Gwynts in their initial fight against Kaftir, they are now actively going after them for their land, which isn't going particularly well. Now, you're probably curious about more character-driven elements of the Gwyntish forces and significant names. There is unfortunately not a lot to go on, but don't you worry none. There's actually a new expansion to the fluff being written as we speak. Personally, I think the Gwynts are one of the more well-written and most interesting factions that we have in the world itself. There's a ton of potential here, especially with the leverage that they hold over Kaftir, and I'm curious to see where it takes us. And yes, I'm gonna be doing an updated version of the lore once the expansion comes out. But now that I've given you a little flavor of the Gwynts, let's build some. For the bodies of all of our Gwynts, we're just going to be using Kaftir bodies as they have essentially the same fatigues. Now, to actually build them into Gwynts, I'm going to be using the STL files provided by Wargames Atlantic and ZombieSmith respectively. The links are in the description. As is my new personalized link, as I am now an affiliate of Wargames Atlantic. Every time you click that link and purchase something from Wargames Atlantic, it gets a little piece to ya boy. Not only do the STLs provide new melons, it also provides extra arms, as well as some new backpacks. In addition to these, I'm going to be using some extra STLs and another expansion for Kaftir arms. When it comes to the melons, I like to sand them down first before applying them. Being that they're resin, you have to use super glue. Sanding it down provides a better, more gritty surface for the glue to adhere to. No more slipping and sliding. As you can see on this guy, I'm actually using one of the plastic bits from the Kaftir set itself, as they use the exact same weapons as Kaftirans. As you can see for his other arm, I'm using that expansion set. Nice little after-battle wine bottle. For the backpacks, I like to line up the super glue right on the straps, and I'm gluing it directly on there. The backpacks are like these huge, large jug sacks, and they have all kinds of cool little bits, little swords, little pots and pans. Kind of an excessive amount of material goods on their backs, but hey, it fits well with their character. Not only am I building some basic units for this video, I also built an officer. The extra plumey hat works perfect on Kaftiran officer models. This one is actually 3D printed as well, though I would suggest that you kitbash this in the slicer rather than gluing it on in person. It's just easier. I gotta say, for how simplistic the models and the characters are in this game, the STL files are incredibly high in detail. Now granted, I have a relatively high quality printer, but I think the simplicity of the models themselves make them really easy to print on just about any printer. And despite how many upgrades and cool bits you get with the base kits, I think it's really nice to have some extra customization. And though I did mention that the items that I'm using are available on Wargames Atlantic and the ZombieSmith site, there are even more STLs available at myminifactory.com under Josh Qualtieri's store. And though I did mention that they do use Kaftir uniforms, there's no reason you can't use Crusaders. I actually kind of kitbashed one up using a bit of Kaftir bits, some of the 3D printed elements, and a Crusader body. Kind of turned this guy into a Gwynt Grenadier of sorts. I figure I show you this as I really didn't add enough kitbashing, or building for that matter, in this video. Think it'd be interesting to show off the bits a little bit more. The art style with the base kits and just about everything in the series works pretty well with one another. Nothing really feels out of place on this figure. I'm just using Kaftir arms on a Crusader body, adding in some pouches here and there. And for that Gwynt backpack, I just added a few grenades. Though I do think going for the more fancy elements of Gwynt really kind of fits their character, but then again, it's your dudes. Now when it comes to painting Gwynts, I think they're a relatively simple scheme. It's quite similar to what I do for Kaftirans, except for the obvious being that they have a bright British red coat. The main color I use is burnt red from Proacryl. It's just that right amount of red. It's not too bright, not too dark, but I do want to shade it, and for that I'm using Carroburg Crimson. Dark washes and warm washes for that matter would probably work just fine, but Carroburg is just the right color in my opinion. It just kind of drives the red further within the scheme, and it gives us more depth to work with. And when it comes to highlighting, all I'm doing is using a little bit more burnt red and slowly mixing it up on the highlights to dragon red. I find that the dragon red is really what seals the deal on this scheme. Though there are other factions like Fidwog that have red in their uniforms, the Gwynts stand out by being a much more bombastic, bright British red. Now when it comes to the other elements of the mini, I think you can really pick up on some of the stuff I talk about in the Quar painting tutorial that I did earlier. I think it's really fun with every faction to kind of change up how you paint the leather, maybe paint the pouches a different color. Little elements like that really make a model stand out. It may not seem like anything that would really change up a scheme, but you'd be surprised how much little elements like that completely change how a model looks. But at the same time, if you want to make the models look pretty much the same as the Koftirans, it wouldn't be out of the question. If they're essentially wearing the same fatigues, it kinda makes sense. And for any little extra bits like the officer's plume, I think it's a good idea to add in some sort of contrasting colors like yellow or gold if you want to. I used Imperial Fist on mine, but I think another cool thing you could do with the officer head is attach it to basic units and just color the plume differently to show their rank. But with that, I think we've effectively gone over everything you need to know about the Gwynts. They're an incredibly cool army. I really like how they look, and I think their lore is really interesting. There's a lot that's to be explored, and I really look forward to it. If I'm not mistaken, they're gonna have their own rule set soon, but I think for now I'm gonna run mine as an alliance squad. I really like how the blue and the red clash together. But hey, I just want to make sort of an official announcement of sorts. I know I kind of mentioned it previously. I'm incredibly happy and honored to be an affiliate of Wargames Atlantic. I've been offered sponsorships before by other companies that just aren't really fitting to the channel. And that isn't to say that I'm officially sponsored. I basically just get a little extra something for doing something I already love. Quar is kind of my favorite thing to paint right now and talk about, if it's not painfully obvious. And again, speaking of Quar, one final little announcement. Just want to take a little moment to promote somebody else that also does Quar content, Procopius. I definitely try to make my lore stuff more goofy and silly, but I find Procopius' stuff to be very fitting and very immersive into the setting, so if you want to check him out, please do that, he deserves it. His uploads are a little infrequent, but hopefully you'll give him some incentive to do more. So yeah. Alright, officially flapping my beak way too much for one video. Make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you liked what you saw, share it with a friend, and remember to mishmash, kitbash, and paint some fantastic miniatures. And you're gonna. I promise. See ya.